ideologies that were taking all of India like as one thing, is that, and although that they are in a position on a number of points, is that they function so well that when you study them, when you get to read about them, you might forget to ask one very important question, which anthropologists really like, is like, where are the people? Because like, this is ideas about a nation, but who are actually like the citizens. And so this is like, and the proof that like these discourses on a national scale were so successful is that it has been very much more easy for the subalternists to critically assess the content of the revolts before independence than after independence. Before independence, under the British Raj, you had like the Sepoy mutinies, riots at Chori Chora, and so on, like which were violent, rebellious events in the 19th century, and these were proofs that like the people were actually empowering themselves to act, maybe not in the nicest of fashion all the time, but after independence, there is like less space within history for the people to actually put forward a rebellious movement, even like especially of the violent kind, and that it gets computed and added to the register of history to say, oh, something is happening. Where like historians recognize all the revolts against the British Raj way more easily than they recognize like revolts against modern India, right? And so in the 19th century, under the British Raj, the wars were waged between like small princely estates and the British, or among princes themselves. But besides, you had like these revolts that were popular in nature, and they could be revolts created because of like change in taxation or the imposition of new burdens in terms of labor. So these popular revolts against the British Raj appears as something we can relate to. They appear to be full of people who we quite like by nature, because just like they're revolting about the colonial powers, this is a normal thing. So at the time, the British would usually write about these events and about their perpetrators in a kind of crude poetry that Ranajit Guha called the prose of counterinsurgency. It's a very interesting thesis that brings to light the fact that the writing style of the British historian literally transformed the authors of the revolt into savages, and whole communities were defined in the history book as backward. That still like under the pen of the British historians. So the local leaders were not leaders anymore, they were troublemakers, and the people that like wanted to act against the British Raj were down to being qualified as primitive, or like all that kind of language. So the first few tomes of the Subaltern series then took act and like we tried to read history against the grain. That is, they started to dig into the archive text to find evidences telling that the rebels in the 19th century were not mindless rioters or far-sicken people, but they were actually like politically engaged actors. And the Subaltern, as a result, decoded the archive left by the colonizers, and they found back in between the lines, or under very unfortunate labels, the many peoples of India. That's where they would hide, like in codes, in text, in history that had been written with a certain approach. So the result was that the myth that was made by the British, that they were the only ones that could administer in a worthy fashion the whole country, was exploded. By discovering these people again, we would see like that the British Raj was not something that was functional. in spite of everything the historians could have written about it. And the simple fact of like disqualifying the revolts was in history books was not enough to actually stop the revolts or to make the people disappear. So India was not made of backward tribes, or it was full of political will again. At the time and after the time of independence, it did change because the leaders were enjoying quite a good repute at some point. As we know, like the history of India during the years leading to the independence, and that's not something like that is very specific to India. Times where a state or a nation ideology is very strong, tend to transfer all the space of history to a couple of leaders, and the people are forgotten in a way. The Salt March, the boycotts, self-reliance movements, like they mostly are pictured as leaders followed by people. The people are not necessarily the creators of anything in this relation. So Indian historiography has made like a great place for these few leaders. And it's only like by sacrificing a whole lot of like different movements in history books that like a nation as a single entity can be born. And the reason why it was assumed that all people that were showing up wherever Gandhi would go and that were following in like the Gandhi protestation belonged to a single movement that was marching to a definite end. And it was a course of history for a nation such as India to like being granted or to take its modern title as a nation. But actually, the fact that the differences in the people that were following Gandhi in such occasion is not questioned is quite problematic. So the subalternists, after like having looked for difference and for different groups in history before independence, did the same thing for the period where Gandhi was active and leading. And what they found is that they ask questions such as like who are actually in the crowds, and they start to look into the archive to see that. And they ask like how do their perceptions of independence of like the whole Gandhi movement were totally different one from each other. So you could have a strike or a demonstration, people from like all places coming in, and they were not thinking they were doing the same thing. But this is not what like a demonstration is never written in history as something that is exploded, like in different pieces. It's usually like a movement of, let's say, 10,000 or 1,000,000 people, and it's a Korean thing, and they have one goal, but it did not quite happen that way. So they found that like followers of Gandhi had different practices and different expectations for independence. And they have like different practice, a lot of which Gandhi did not approve of himself. And you can think like during these years there had been like looting of markets, some demonstrations that were violent. British officials have been murdered. We're far from the peaceful path of Gandhi here. Interestingly enough as well, the people were thinking Gandhi had some like divine powers. He could make dead trees go back to life. He could have crops go good or bad. So he was seen as a godly incarnation. These were the people that were actually following him as well, and they would like start a cult of Gandhi. And Gandhi was again the cult of the people to himself, kind of thing. So like all these dissensions and contention in history sometimes like just get smoothed over, and we have a neat text of like India coming to modernity kind of thing. But the coming of modernity does exist. It just acted by people with very different expectations, right? So the conclusions the subalternists reached was that the nation that supported independence was a myth, and the fact that it was not a single thing, a single fighting for one idea, but it was, and I think it is still today, comprising many different nations, smaller nations kind of thing, and it could never be summarized as a single movement. So one of these nations that still exist today and which strive and thrive and cope as good they can under the myth of the nation up to these days then is the Van Gogh jar. So that's my articulation from one day to the other. All right. So should I summarize the whole? Like I have something to summarize the first part, but I think it's been pretty explicit. I'll just. So what are the Van Gogh jars? Well, you learn that by heart. I don't even know it by heart. The vegetarian, Sufi, Muslim, nomadic, or I actually know it by heart. But so yeah, I'm interested in the Van Gogh jars, the ones that are either living in or around Rajji National Park, not very far from here. Basically out of Aberdeen. And so like vegetarian, Sufi, Muslim, nomadic herders, but I will less focus here on the dietary or the religious aspect, although they're very interesting because when you ask yourself, how come Muslim became vegetarian, if it could, like on the one hand, alienate themselves from their brothers in religion, but yet they never surrendered to any kind of like Hindu Brahmanic practices either. So where did it, like the position of the Van Gogh jar is pretty interesting. I mean, these guys really affected to a point zigzags in their history that I think like I would investigating. But what I will focus here on is mostly like the semi-nomadism and the pastoral buffalo herding. So semi-nomadism because they do have camps. They're not on the move year-round. They spend winter in the Himalaya pastures where the cattle graze, and they spend the winter, as I was saying, like just out of Dehradun and up to UP. And that's the pastoralism without referring to any like scientific definition. It would be following the cattle uphill, downhill, and following the cattle according to its own needs, its own grazing regime according to season. A scholar had titled one of her articles on the Van Gogh jars before, "Feet Following Hooves," which I find pretty telling, pretty. So the Van Gogh jars. So they have inhabited the region and used the local resources in Uttarakhand, in UP as well, because they're traditional migratory routes are crossing a boundary that did not exist when they all started these migrations, right? So they've done that for centuries. But until now, the right of access they and their animals enjoy have not been constitutionally granted, although some steps have been taken in this direction. But some of these steps include resettlement scheme, and so the state is looking at how to settle down the Van Gogh jars, so we cannot get rid of the problem imposed by like nomadic people that now like cross all kinds of boundaries, from state boundaries to protected areas boundaries as well. So I argue that the myth of the nation and the mainstream idea of like the subject of the Indian nation in general is a subject of progress and modernity, which include like a house, a permanent one with a civic address, and sending kids to school and watching TV and knowing about like Bollywood movies and things like that, which is like a really neat thing, but it does not describe the Van Gogh jar themselves, and it does not help them to have big majority groups that are pretty interesting people defend themselves as always like different in contention. So through their history, the Van Gogharas